Cowboy wanted a servant, but the woman he bought became the mother of his children. The evening had fallen heavy over the town, the sky bruised with the last purples of daylight as lanterns were lit one by one along the auction yard. Dust hung in the air, stirred by restless boots and the stamping hooves of cattle penned beyond the rails. Men leaned against posts, hats tilted low, their voices carrying the dry amusement of those who came not just by but to judge. Among them stood Elias Boone, a tall figure with shoulders bent by years of ranch work, his coat worn thin, and his face marked by a scar that ran like a white whisper along his jaw. He had come for practicality, not pleasure, and yet the moment his gaze settled on the woman standing on the platform, he felt a strange quietness take hold. She was thin, her dress plain, her wrists bound in front with a cord that rubbed raw at the skin. The auctioneer barked numbers into the dust, and though her chin lifted in a small act of defiance, her eyes betrayed the weight of shame. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Boone's got no woman left in him. He's buying labor. Another laughed. Servant's cheaper than a wife, I reckon. Elias kept his jaw set and his hand steady, raising his bid without hesitation until the gavel fell. The woman, Clara May, the papers called her, was his now, though the word itself sat bitter in his chest. She did not look at him as she was led down, only at the horizon where the prairie stretched, endless and unforgiving. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, save for the creak of saddle leather and the crunch of hooves on dry earth. Elias offered no words, and Clara asked for none. When they reached his land, she saw not prosperity but isolation. Fences in need of mending, a barn roof sagging, the house itself weathered gray by sun and storm. He dismounted, handed her the rope of her small bundle of belongings, and gestured toward the door. Inside, shadows clung to corners, the hearth cold, a silence pressing down heavier than the sky outside. "You'll keep the place," he said at last, voice rough as gravel. "Cook, mend, see what needs seeing. That's all." Clara nodded once, her face unreadable, and turned toward the kitchen without a word. Days passed like wind through brittle grass. Clara moved quietly through the house, sweeping dust, patching torn curtains, cooking meals that often went untouched until Elias returned late from fields. He rarely spoke beyond necessity. At night she lay on a narrow cot in the small back room, listening to the coyotes cry across the plains, wondering if this silence was her fate. In town, the whispers grew sharper. Children laughed cruelly when she passed, repeating the words their fathers muttered. Bought woman, servant wife. She lowered her gaze, cheeks burning, yet she carried herself with a spine unbent, refusing to let the shame hollow her out completely. Elias heard the gossip, though he pretended not to. At the saloon, men nudged one another, sneering that he had settled for a woman no one else wanted. He drank his whiskey alone and left without reply, but the words clung to him like burrs. Back at the ranch, he found Clara fixing a broken chair, her fingers steady despite the splintered wood. He wanted to thank her, but instead left coins on the table, his tongue clumsy with what could not be said. One afternoon a storm rolled sudden from the west, black clouds gathering fast. Elias returned from the pasture to find Clara on the roof, rain lashing her hair flat against her face as she hammered a loose shingle back into place. "Get down," he shouted, but she shook her head, her skirt clinging, hands gripping the hammer with stubborn resolve. He climbed up himself, taking the tool from her before she slipped. They worked in silence, side by side, the storm soaking them both until the roof held firm again. When they climbed down, she turned away to hide her trembling hands, but Elias saw the spark in her eyes, a fire he had not expected. Something in him shifted, though he could not name it. That night the prairie wolves came, their howls circling the ranch. A calf bawled in terror as the pack closed in. Elias grabbed his rifle, running for the barn, but when he reached it, he found Clara already there, lantern raised high, standing between the wolves and the trembling calf. Her face was pale, her body slight, but her stance was unyielding. Elias fired, the shot scattering the beasts into the darkness. When the quiet returned, he looked at her differently, no longer as the servant he had purchased, but as someone braver than many men he had known. The town did not see that night, but gossip found its way regardless. "Boone's gone soft with servant," they said. Clara heard them when she went for supplies, her chest tightening. Yet she also carried a new pride, though it frightened her. One evening she found a shawl folded neatly by the hearth, the fabric old but cared for, smelling faintly of cedar. It had been Elias's mother's. He said nothing, only left it there. She pressed it to her chest when no one watched, the gesture speaking louder than words. Weeks bled into months. Elias's hand was crushed one day under a fallen timber, and Clara was the one who cleaned the wound, washing the blood from his skin with a gentleness that made his breath catch. He had not allowed anyone close in years, but her touch was steady, her eyes unflinching. That night, for the first time, he told her the woman he had once loved, taken by fever before they could wed. Silence followed his words, yet in her eyes he saw not pity but recognition, as if grief had carved similar lines in them both. The bond between them deepened, though still unspoken, when children in town mocked Clara. Calling her bought woman, Elias's anger erupted. He confronted their parents in the dusty street, voice like thunder, making it clear she would not be shamed under his roof. Clara watched from the doorway of the mercantile, her chest tight with something dangerously close to gratitude. That night she left a small loaf of bread cooling on the table, the crust shaped carefully, almost tenderly. He ate it without a word, but sat longer at the table than usual, the silence gentler than before. Then came the fire. It was a dry, wind-torn evening when the barn caught flame, a lantern tipped by some careless draught. The blaze roared fast, devouring wood and hay, horses screaming in their stalls. Elias ran first, pulling open doors, shouting for the animals to flee, but smoke choked his lungs and flames drove him back. Clara peered through the haze, shawl wrapped over her mouth, her eyes fierce as she dragged a foal by its halter to the firelit doorway. Sparks bit her arm, smoke blackened her skin, but she did not falter. Elias stumbled, falling to one knee, the heat pressing him down. She seized his arm, pulling with strength born of desperation, until they burst into the open air together, collapsing onto the dirt. The townsfolk, drawn by the fire's glow, arrived too late to help but just in time to witness. They saw Clara's scorched arms, Elias leaning against her shoulder, the freed horses stamping wild against the night. Murmurs spread, but this time there was no mockery, only awe. The woman they called servant had stood in flame and pulled the cowboy from death itself. When the fire finally died, leaving the barn a blackened shell, Elias sat on the porch steps, his face cut with ashen grief for what was lost. Clara sank beside him, her body trembling. For a long while neither spoke. Then he turned, his eyes stripped of all defenses, and said low and rough, "You saved what I couldn't. You saved me." The words hung in the dawn air as the first light broke over the prairie, painting the ruins in gold. Clara felt the weight she had carried since the auction lift, not fully but enough to breathe. She was no servant now, no object of purchase. She was his equal, his partner, the mother his children had yet to know. They sat together in silence, ash drifting like snow, and in that stillness something stronger than fire bound them. And if years later their children heard whispers in town of how their mother had been bought, they would also hear the truer story, that she stayed, not from chains or from choice, and built a home from ruin with a man who had once forgotten how to live. Love, they would learn, does not always arrive with grand gestures or easy words. Sometimes it begins in silence, grows in hardship, and is proven in flame. And for those willing to endure, it becomes a kind of bond that no gossip, no fire, no passing of years can undo.